So, Mark, thank you for coming. We welcome you here, and we thank you for your continued interest. So I guess my first question to you, and by the way, as you can tell, this is now an interview and not a keynote, but the interview would start with this simple question. You and the Obama administration held the first ever White House Arctic Science Ministerial. And that was particularly interesting to many of us, and we thought particularly important. So I wonder if you would just share with us a little bit about the insight behind why the Obama administration decided to build out not just the Arctic interest, but also the motives behind building the Science Ministerial and why at that time it was put together, and then we'll walk through perhaps some ripple effects to the legacy on that. That's a long introduction, but welcome.
Thank you, Mike. It is great to see you. I kind of feel like this is an Arctic reunion. I'm seeing a lot of old friends when I was serving President Obama in the White House on the Arctic issue. And also congratulations to you, Jane Harman, Alice Rogoff, for pulling together this fantastic polar initiative here in the heart of Washington, which must be involved in the dialogue on the future of the Arctic, because we are an Arctic nation. Too few Americans know that, and that is to our disadvantage. You have an enormous opportunity and challenge right before you in terms of what you drive forward with the Institute. Science and Arctic science. Why did we focus on that in the last year of the Obama administration? I also want to say that I'm joined here in the front row by actual Arctic scientists like Martin Jeffries and professionals who have been working the Arctic issue like David Kennedy and Evan Bloom and John, who runs the U.S. Arctic Research Commission. It was a fantastic team, and I just really appreciate their collegiality. Kelly Faulkner from the National Science Foundation as well. The Obama administration built out a White House Arctic Science Ministerial because, as you know, our government is a vertically integrated management structure with the tone and the vision set from the tippy top, namely the president. And for President Obama, the looming crisis in the Arctic is a tangible preview of the looming crisis of the global condition. The Arctic is a foreshadow. It is an opportunity to see the challenges and opportunities that are coming our way because of what is impacting there first. And if there is one thing that President Obama felt strongly about, it's that science increasingly shows that we have underestimated the acceleration of the change in the Arctic, and that we need better and more conclusive science regarding what is happening there, because the interest that we have at stake directly pertains to the self-interest that we all share, and that is what kind of world our children inherit. And what the science shows is that that world will have societies that along the coast are basically contracting because of sea level rise, coastal erosion, climatic change that we better understand more thoroughly. And what the president gleaned when he traveled to the Arctic, as the first US president to do so in the fall of 2015, is that Arctic science is in certain ways fragmented and not truly pan-Arctic, pan-polar. We have 8 Arctic countries around the Arctic Circle. We have an increasingly global interest on the Arctic and an opportunity to come together and cooperate on the Arctic, and yet our science is fragmented. How can we develop a platform, using the platform of the White House, to develop alignments, combinations, whereby we pool the best science from America, Europe, Russia, Asia, together to produce the best result? And that was the essence of why we did the White House Arctic Science Ministerial. And and the directive from above was that it is to not only include only Arctic countries, but countries from around the world that have made investments in Arctic research and science. So that's why we had the EU there, why we had Germany there, the UK, Korea, China, India, Singapore. They're not along the edge of the Arctic, but they've made significant investments in Arctic research and science and need to be at the table. That was what pulled together the first ever White House Arctic Science Ministerial with 25 governments, and it was a huge success locally and a huge success globally. Locally, it brought in all the stakeholders from our Arctic, from Alaska, from the local communities. The day before the White House Arctic Science Ministerial, we had a pre-ministerial briefing for Arctic native communities who came in from all over Alaska and all over the world, whereby we could share with them the initiatives and deliverables we would roll out the next day, but also draw from them what are their ideas, what are their questions that we should put to representatives from governments around the world. And on the day of the ministerial, the White House announced more than 40 combinations and deliverables and alignments that takes the shoulder off the American people and puts the Arctic in the context that it belongs, that the Arctic is not just an American problem or an American opportunity, it's an international problem and an international opportunity, and this is an opportunity to come together on it. And it is, I think, great that the European Union has committed to do the next Arctic Science Ministerial in 2018, and it is incredibly important that that be executed and tactically implemented with the kind of openness and thoroughness that we saw in the first one.
Well, thank you for that. I wonder, I have many questions, but I wonder, let me start here with this first one, and that is, how receptive were the other countries, the Arctic 8, but also the other countries, to the idea, the concept of not only discussing this, but bringing basically their assets to the table, and then, in my opinion, setting a pathway forward?
The answer, Mike, is that it varies. Some countries, especially Canada, after the election of Trudeau, were ginormously all in. They thought this was exactly what the doctor ordered. And actually, Canada was a little bit the test case for us, because Trudeau was elected in October of 2015 or November of 2015, to my recollection. And we began to internally within the White House tee up the possibility that we would do a state visit for Justin Trudeau in March of 2016. And we decided to float the possibility of announcing the White House Arctic Science Ministerial during the Justin Trudeau state visit because of the North American neighborhood relationship around the Arctic, and also because after Brian Deese went up to Ottawa and began to brief the Chief of Staff, Jerry Butts is his name, for Trudeau, there was huge enthusiasm on their part. And so we thought that this would be a nice colloquy to have the president and Justin Trudeau do during the state visit as kind of an opportunity to give some visibility to it. I can tell you that as an operative in the White House, there's a lot of competition within the White House for the agenda of the president. And I was worried that the Arctic might slip. And so I worked very closely with close friends on the National Security Council to make sure that the language of the White House Arctic Science Ministerial was put into the press conference between the Canadian head of government, Justin Trudeau, and President Obama, because once it's announced, it has to happen. And so that did happen in March. And we also had as a default possibility that if Russia pulled out of the White House Arctic Science Ministerial, we could still make this about the North American Arctic with the Canadians and the Americans kind of driving it, even if the Russians in the last minute, for other political reasons, decided not to attend at all. We learned that a little bit in the lead up to Glacier, that when we thought that we would have a higher level Russian participation at Glacier, and Kishiak, attended, the Russian ambassador in Washington, but we thought we might get a higher level person. So we had to have as a contingency the fact that the Russians may agree to this and in the last minute pull out. And so the Canadians were our default that we were going to do this no matter what. And once it was announced during the state visit in March that this would occur in the early fall, it was all systems go.
So what were the concerns? You raised the issue of Russia maybe not attending. What were the concerns there, or what was the dialogue between the U.S. and Russia about even questioning whether or not Russia would participate?
Well, because we obviously have in Northern Europe with Russia a lot of other disagreements concerning Ukraine, concerning security in Northern Europe writ large, concerning Syria, concerning sanctions. And so it is just something that we had to prepare for. I mean, we obviously did not have that situation emerge, but we had to think it through. In the end, one of the panels of the White House Arctic Science Ministerial was co-chaired by the head of the Russian delegation. And the White House Arctic Science Ministerial focused on observing and monitoring STEM in the Arctic, the Russians, we specifically, John Holdren, the president's science advisor, specifically invited the Russians to co-chair, as I remember, the very first session.
So would you say
on Arctic science and research?
So would you say that the science ministerial, the agreement in Fairbanks, the Fairbanks Declaration that included the agreement on research in the Arctic, is there a line between the ministerial that you held and the agreement in Fairbanks, and to what degree might they have influenced or informed each other?
Well, what I thought that there was a more, to me personally, direct line between was what was discussed this morning, and that is that under the rubric or under the umbrella of the Arctic Council, the new cooperation agreement on science and technology that was co-chaired by the US and Russia, and which is about the kind of operational reality in which the Arctic Council countries will work together on science and research, complemented well what we did with the first White House Arctic Science Ministerial, in the sense that the ministerial in September of 2016 rolled out specific alignments that we're going to be doing this cruise in the Arctic Ocean to study this change in terms of ocean acidification, specific actual scientific projects that need to be done. It was so we specifically worked in developing those in the lead up to the White House Arctic Science Ministerial. There was a core group of Arctic scientists that worked on the team to develop the White House Arctic Science Ministerial that was led by Martin Jeffries from the Office of Naval Research, hugely supported by the U.S. Arctic Research Commission. And I failed to mention John Farrell's last name early in the conversation. John Farrell was unbelievable in terms of the resources he brought from the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, so that we could sift through all the different scientific proposals we received from around the federal agencies, from around the United States, from research universities and research institutes, and from around the world, especially from the countries that were going to be participating and sending ministerial delegations to the White House Arctic Science Ministerial. Huge numbers of scientific projects and proposals and research combinations were put out there, and they had to be vetted and tested and thought through and developed by the scientific team that was under Martin Jeffries' leadership.
So in terms of weaving this all together, the big takeaways from you are that you've actually helped build a structure with the other countries, but White House leadership to build a structure upon which or through which not only the ministerial happened, and not only the components of the declaration that came out of Fairbanks, but perhaps now setting the stage for the EU, Germany, and Finland to now take this ministerial to the next level, correct?
Well, Mike, to me, the White House Arctic Science Ministerial was the essence of science diplomacy. How people can look beyond differences, strategic differences, differences of opinion on how to handle a certain challenge, and come together around science and the importance of science and a better understanding of the world that we are going to leave behind to our children. And that was what there was a crying need for on the Arctic issue. What was needed was a platform for governments to come together on the issue, and that was what was created. And it's living beyond the Obama administration. I think that's incredibly important, because I think a lot of the good relationships that were reflected this morning on the Arctic issue were a reflection of the goodwill that was brought to the table at the White House Arctic Science Ministerial, and which should continue as the next Arctic Science Ministerial is developed that the EU will host.
Thank you. We have a couple of minutes left, and so I think this is excellent platform and foundation for what's going to happen next. There'll be a couple of panels on science, policy, support, and then actually listening to scientists who are doing the work in the field. Right. So this is a really nice foundation. But I want to go back to the very beginning and use our last minute and a half, 2 minutes to talk about the following, that this ministerial had two components. One was bringing together indigenous leaders to talk about their landscape, their knowledge sets, get their input onto the ministerial, and then there was the ministerial. Can you talk to me a minute about your feelings in terms of the inclusion of indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, in what we would call Western science, and where you see that going, and what's the role of indigenous knowledge going forward, or is there a role going forward?
Well, the Arctic is simultaneously a strategic challenge and a human challenge. And the human challenge was reflected in the gathering that we pulled together preceding the ministerial of particularly Native societies and communities that live above the Arctic Circle and whose ways of life are changing intrinsically because of the impacts of climate change and because of other challenges that are more universal in terms of social problems and this type of thing that we all have a moral obligation to address. And to me, when that gathering in the Indian Treaty Room of the old Executive Office building next to the White House occurred, and the Indian Treaty Room is named for that because that was the room that the treaties that the U.S. government had negotiated with Native American tribes back in the 1800s and the 1700s that were very one-sided and exploitative and usurious. The fact that that meeting was held in that room, and what we heard from the communities was, thank you for bringing us to the table as the experts, as the people who truly understand what is happening in the Arctic, so that you in the American government can listen and learn and derive a way forward for our country and for our world in combination with the other governments. Thank you for doing that was a very good, I think, result for the president and a good reason why we did that particular ministerial. And the strategic context, I think the benefits of that are obvious, especially now. We live in a increasingly polarized society and polarized world, and we need things that are seen as objectively good to pull us together. And it goes back to science, and science is a way of improving the quality of our life and what world we leave to our children. Nothing brings people together more than that, and that's why I think the ministerial was such a good thing to do, and it was a success.
Mark, thank you. I think we've come full circle from where we started.
Thank you, Mike.
A great tour, and please thank Ambassador Mark Brzezinski for his comments.
Thank you.
And I think,
thank you.
I think it does set the tone very nicely for these next two sessions. And Mark, thank you for your service, your vision. And when you were the executive director, you actually walked the talk. We talked early on in your tenure there, and I said you needed to come to Alaska and visit and see what it's all about and talk to those who actually live there. And you did that, and for that I appreciate you very much.
And I did it in January when it was cold.
That gets you street cred in Alaska. Okay, Mark Brzezinski.
Thank you.